Good afternoon. Winterview back again with another brief dialogue on his way home from a hard day's work in the office, treating mental illness, apparently. This brief dialogue, once again, for his dear friend Annastacey. The subject is a follow-on from an earlier topic discussed about cause and effect, something that is often puzzling to seekers, puzzling to the mind, puzzling to get one's head around, so to speak. And just a reminder that these dialogues are intended for the mind. These are actually targeted to the mind, just to give the mind a bit of understanding, that's all. A bit of relief, perhaps. Filling the missing jigsaw piece, you could say. The mind, the structure of the mind, is perhaps a broader topic, a broader sort of heading for this topic. The mind obviously is what we call thought, but there's a lot more to it than just a bunch of thoughts. And this particular topic is a feature of the way the mind operates. The mind more or less tends to reveal the world in a coherent narrative, a cause and effect structure. The basis for this is probably biological, in that it serves the organism very well to recognize patterns and to be able to attribute cause, I would suggest. The ability to recognize cause would seem to have some adaptive benefit to the organism, to give it some edge, survival edge, over competitors, say, for limited resources. The more intelligent an organism, the better equipped or better able that organism is to survive, to detect patterns that other organisms can't detect. Gives it an adaptive advantage, perhaps, over others. But more to the point, the fundamental concept here is that the mind is forever attributing cause to phenomena that it perceives. Something must cause a something. This in some ways relates to a greater philosophy of positivism, logical positivism in some ways. But for the purposes of this brief dialogue, we could just say that it tries to figure stuff out, why stuff happens. And we see this throughout the history of humanity. Cultures, tribes, individuals are always trying to figure out why stuff happens. And the belief is that if something can be figured out, then I'll have an edge, an advantage, or it'll serve some purpose. But obviously the premise is that there is a causal force or causal agent, causal mechanism that I can figure out. This is how it unfolds. This is how the story of the mind unfolds. Historically, you could say, for instance, that without a narrative about science, the causal agents of the world were seen to be very mysterious. And you could argue perhaps that the idea of God, gods, of spirits, of demons, of angels, of unseen entities, broadly speaking, served that purpose to fill in the blanks about what is causing certain things to happen in the world or to me. Why am I behaving like this? Why is life happening to me like this, and so forth? The evolved narrative around that, you could also argue, is the scientific narrative. The same fundamental purpose, to figure out the causal mechanisms behind stuff. So gods, demons, angels, entities, spirits, forces of nature and so forth are replaced by so-called scientific principles, scientific laws, gravity, nuclear energy, electromagnetic energy, physics, why this happens, by cell biology, fluid dynamics, all that sort of stuff becomes, or has become, the dominant narrative. And more recently, we have epigenetics, or genetics in general. It seems to be very popular, and also looking at the brain, the biological basis for why we behave in certain ways, and how our genes influence. Always some agent. There's always no matter which slice of history we take, it seems there's always a dominant narrative about something that causes something else. And of course, within the narrative, the agents appear to be true. There seems to be some truth to that. And even those so-called primitive beliefs of gods and angels and demons, they still hold great sway over large populations in present society. There's still that narrative about how luck transforms people's lives, or bad luck, how God favors some football team and they win. That's still a part of the dominant narrative. And now that science seems to be the dominant social force in many countries, there's a new narrative about science versus religion, or science versus superstition. In that one is so-called fact and the other is fiction. Both obviously not recognizing that they are both just an appearance. And in that way, homogeneous. And so we come now to questions about one's life. That's where this dialogue ultimately leads, and that's where the line of thinking ultimately leads. If we go to a bookstore, not that there seems to be many bookstores anymore, that's just the way the world has changed, that there's a self-help section. The fact that there's a self-help section, and not only that, it has grown exponentially for the last 20 years, suggests that the apparent individual is very interested in the subject in general, about the agents of change, the factors of change in one's life. So central to that narrative, of course, must be person. The person to whom it all refers. The person who is buying the self-help book. The self that indeed thinks it needs help. The idea that if things can change, then I can change them. The idea that things are changeable. That this is a life of opportunity and potential. And if I can figure out the agents of change, I can somehow manipulate my life for what I might call a favorable outcome. And however it arrives, it doesn't matter necessarily to the self. As long as the agents of change somehow fit with one's beliefs, then the individual attempts to use that. So if you had a book on prayer, praying to God for wealth, if God and prayer weren't really your thing, your belief system, you would probably not buy that book. But if you had a book that said how to reprogram negative thinking about money so you can have better wealth, you might be more inclined. It sounds a bit more scientific, a bit more plausible. But at the end of the day, it's all about this self achieving some change or manipulating something called life for a better outcome. And that generally translates, if you whittle it down, to better emotional states, happier emotional states, a life that is full of meaning and happiness and purpose. Seems to be the more or less speaking, the general goal. And then it comes down to a different level of sophistication for cause, for change. We've looked at the gross mechanisms, science or God, and we've looked at some of the mechanics like therapy, changing beliefs, changing your energy in your body, your chi energy, or balancing your chakras, changing your diet, and so forth. Things that will seem to have an impact, a causal change on the person. We eventually come down to a more subtle level. And that's another feature of the mind, is to become infinitely more subtle, with obviously a belief that micro changes are more powerful, or at least need to be considered, as well as the gross changes, the big changes. It's not enough just to become vegetarian and get a better job and go to the gym. One has to look at some of the very subtle, nuanced facets of the self to effect good change. Or, if the big things aren't having any effect, we look at the little tiny things, perhaps, in order to get that change. Once again, though, still the same pattern unfolding, that there is a self, and there are agents of change, of agencies of change, that I can figure out somehow. And then we come down to this very subtle, might say almost baseline level, where we start talking about awareness and consciousness and those wonderfully mystical sounding things, and that somehow that we're in this universe that is all one energy, and still there's this very subtle, ultimately very subtle duality in there, that yes, it's all one, and I separately am part of the one, still trying to recognize the separateness in the one. And if I learn to cultivate my awareness, or learn to be still in some way, so I become very still, that this giant oneness that I'm part of, or I am, will subtly but definitely shift in my favor. That hope, that awful hope that it will change for the better. And that when we get down to that subtle level, that the level at which we call just consciousness or awareness, we notice that even down at that level, that there must be the agent of change is something that's slightly behind the scenes, over my shoulder almost, this subtle knowingness, this subtle awareness of life seems to be this one step removed agent. And it seems that's the base level to which the mind can travel. And we have practices down at that level, mindfulness practices, meditation practices, developing awareness, sitting in stillness, cultivating a state of now, all those things, so that I can be in presence, I can be in awareness, all that sort of dialogue, all very dual, very maybe subtly dual, but dual nonetheless. And the reason it stays dual, or a state of duality, is because given the structure of mind, it cannot think outside of that paradigm. It cannot comprehend an object in the world without placing something that is aware of that object. So that is the baseline functioning of mind, this very subtle placement, or displacement if you prefer, of a person who is aware, or a thing even, that is aware of the world. The mind is doing that. That is another state of mind. And these subtle states of awareness and mindfulness ultimately are a very subtle form of dissociation. Just very subtle though, not a gross dissociation that you would see in a mental health disorder, but taking oneself out of the picture, so to speak, like stepping back from the world, becoming aware of the events of the world without attaching oneself to them, just allowing them, still requires that removal of not the person anymore at that level, but just awareness. I'm removing awareness. I'm separating out awareness from the event. What the mind can never see, where it can never get to, is just the event without any awareness of it or anyone who is aware. It can't go there, because that would require it's like the eye seeing itself, the eye somehow looking at itself, the sound hearing its own soundness, that all those Zen paradoxy kind of statements. It would require that, which it can't do. It just can't do it. And that is why a lot of teachers or speakers or books will say that over and over again. The mind cannot get there, it cannot take you there. You can't think your way there, so to speak. And that brings up a lot of strange reactions, I shouldn't say strange, a lot of different reactions. A sort of an annoyance, a rejection, it's a nuisance, it makes some people try harder, and so forth. It's the mind trying to rid itself of itself, you might even say. That's another way of putting it. But the idea, the model that I like the best for this state of affairs, you could say, is the dream model, but with one very subtle modification, or maybe not so subtle, is that there's no dreamer, there's just the dream without the dreamer. Because often in a dream you'll find that you have some kind of point of reference, like a third person perspective looking down on the dream, or in your own body in the dream. But this is the dream without a dreamer. It's just the dream. And the reason I like the model of the dream for this is because in the dream it's all just made of dream substance, whatever that is. All just consciousness, we might say. Not that that's particularly descriptive, but it's all something mental, like a mental energy, you could even say. So on waking up from the dream, there's two things you could say about it. One is, it seemed like I was riding a dragon through the mountains of Bavaria in the Middle Ages. It seemed like that in the dream, but it was just a dream, so nothing was happening. Really, nothing happened. It just seemed like something was happening. That's why I like the dream. It really captures that paradox. And the struggle for the mind is that the mind exists in the story that's unfolding in the dream, or at least the person exists in the story that is unfolding in the dream. The model falls down, you might say, in that the mind will, on hearing that, will try and separate itself out of the dream, like the dream appeared in my awareness, in my consciousness, and I'm not the dream. It's still taking oneself out subtly to place oneself at a third-person reference point, or a personal reference point, is another way of saying it. So this acknowledges the functioning of the mind. This brief dialogue is just acknowledging that that's what the mind does. No one is doing it. It just does it. But it also acknowledges or reminds, I guess, the mind itself that there's no way out of that. You can't separate out from it. And the separating out from it is still duality, whether it's awareness or consciousness or knowingness or stillness, or the presence, whatever word you give it. The mind will inevitably just create that subtle separation. Naturally, it'll do that. And gives a very powerful illusion to the seeker very often that they're somehow progressing in their enlightenment. I'm becoming very still. I'm separating myself very nicely from the appearance. I'm not getting caught up in the day-to-day hassles of life because I'm developing a sort of state of awareness or a mindfulness about that. There certainly can be some psychological benefit to that skill, but that is a mental skill, let's not forget, that you are developing. And in that way, it remains a very subtle dissociation, a very subtle tuning out from the world. I'm not knocking it, of course. I do use mindfulness techniques in my practice with certain clients who have a facility for that, who tend to get caught up very tightly in the machinations of their own dramatic stories. It can be quite useful. But this is a different context. This is talking about liberation and enlightenment, and that is not a topic that is used in a clinical setting. It has no utility there, you might say, no reason to be discussing it, and would be very unhelpful clinically. It also flags that even the difficulty talking about this subject in general, if it's not already obvious, that talking about enlightenment or non-duality makes it seem like something, like we're talking about something. Because we can label it and talk about it, it is a thing. What we're talking about is life as it happens, so to speak. But because we can't capture that immediacy, because words can't capture that, it ends up in a narrative that unfolds in time and space. It gives a very powerful sense that we're learning about it, or it can be learned about. We can talk about it logically, or we can learn something about, it seems to create that very easily. So the bad news, there's no way out. There's nothing to do. There's no one to do it. It's awful. It's terrible. I wish there was something to do. Be easier, wouldn't it? Anyway, that's all I wanted to say on that. Thanks again for listening, and as usual, your comments are very welcome.